to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. We're going to go ahead and get started. Mark chapter 8. Let's see. Let me move this back a little bit. Do that. And then I'll move like this. Okay. Mark chapter 8. If you want to go through verse 14. Last week we talked about the Pharisees and the scribes wanting a sign. And Jesus said, a sign will not be given to this generation. And then he gets in the boat, he goes to the other side, and then he speaks. Okay? Verse 14, it says, now they had forgotten to bring bread. It seems to be a common... I guess, you know what, you could say, well, they were relying on God to give them their daily bread. So they had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. Now, you can see where there's going to be a confusion. This is a regular occurrence with the people that Jesus was speaking to. There's a confusion between the physical and the spiritual. And we'll see it again here before too long, where Jesus says, I will tear this down. I'm going to tear down this building. It will be torn down in 3 days. This will be torn down, talking about his physical body. They were thinking he was talking about the temple. They were confusing the spiritual and the physical. And here's another case where they confuse the physical and the spiritual because they're talking about bread. And of course, you know, if you're talking about bread, this conversation makes sense if you're talking about bread. And I guess we could probably forgive them for being confused about it. But this tells us that even the apostles didn't always have their mind on spiritual things. They were much like the people today. People have their mind on the physical. You know, we seem to believe that the things that are going on in our physical lives, the physical things that are going on, are the most important things that are going on in our lives. And truth be told, they're really not. Our minds are not always on the spiritual. Oftentimes we are distracted by the things of this world. He says, so they have no bread in the boat. They have one loaf. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. All right, now, okay, well, let's look a little bit further. He says, watch out. Okay, so the term watch out is beware. All right, what does that mean? To be on guard for, right? To be watchful for. Be watchful of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So what do? What do the disciples begin to do? In verse 16, they start talking about this. Hold on, beware of the leaven, but we have no bread. And they're still considering the physical of everything that he's saying. They're still looking at the physicality of it, the here and the now. Okay, so Jesus, aware of this, of course, discerning in their hearts what they're talking about, he's aware of this. He says to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember?" Okay. Now, he says all of this. I believe that this is not so much as a stern rebuke as it is a gentle reminder to keep your mind on the things of God. Keep your attention, pay attention to things listen to everything that I'm telling you. I'm not going to be with you always. I want you to remember the things that are happening while I'm talking to you. Remember the lessons that I'm trying to get across to you. The things, even the parables that I give you, the physical things that are in those parables represent spiritual things. So always be on guard for what I'm telling you. Have discernment. All right? So then he goes into this. He says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? It's interesting, it stops right here. So the question then is, did they understand or did they not understand? And if they didn't understand, do we understand what he's talking about here? All right, so let's look at this. Here we have the physical bread, and he's talking about spiritual leaven. All right, what happens, what occurs? Okay, so let's look at this. The leaven, beware of the leaven of who? Herod and the Pharisees. All right. So you have the leaven of Herod and the leaven of the Pharisees. What is this? What is he talking about in the idea of leaven? What they do, what they speak about. Okay. What does leaven do? What is the purpose of leaven? It gives an increase. Okay. So when he talks about the leaven of Herod and the leaven of the Pharisees, what physically, how does that manifest itself? It's a spiritual thing. But how does it manifest itself physically? How do you see the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees? Okay, so once it gets into it, okay, let's ask this question. Once you put yeast into a mix, can you get that yeast back out again? What has to happen? You got to throw away the whole thing, right? You can't go in out of that mixture and start picking out yeast. It just doesn't happen that way. So what happens when those doctrines? Now let's think about this, because you got 2 different things here. We got to remember this: Herod and the Pharisees. Knowing Herod and knowing the Pharisees, do those 2 people have anything in common? Good in common? No, good in common. Herod was a secular Jew, essentially. Okay. His belief and adherence to Jewish law was basically non-existent. Everything he did was that he might be magnified. All right? And we find this later on. His whole thing was, I want to be thought of as someone important. He wanted to continue the Herodian dynasty. His whole goal was to magnify himself. All right? So here you have an enemy of God. All right? I'm trying to think of the best way. Here you have an enemy of God. In 2 different capacities, right? With Herod, you have an enemy of God that was certainly not atheist, but he was secular in his being an enemy of God. Then you have the Pharisees. Were they friends of God? No, they were enemies of God because of their actions. Their problem was they adhered too much. They neglected the important things, and they were more concerned with the strict adherence to even the most minute portions of rabbinical law. So here you have 2 enemies of God, both of them taking a different tack, but both of them being in opposition to God. All right, so here you have the leaven of Herod. So what would be the leaven of Herod? The idea of not needing to adhere to God, becoming Hellenistic in your approach to God. It's not really important that you adhere to, that you abide in the law of God. It's just simply, by your very existence, everything is okay. You don't have to worry about any of that. Don't worry about the commandments. Don't worry about any of those things. And then you have the Pharisees, where adherence to the minutia of the law is the most important thing. But both of those are problems, and both of those would make you in opposition to God. And both of them have the ability to ingrain themselves into the use a human made-up word, the psyche of the average Jew at the time. You could go one way, you could go another. Both of those will take you away from God. Both of those. Either direction is going to take you away from the direction that you need to be going. And if it gets a hold, what's going to happen? It's going to be more and more difficult to take that out and get back to where you need to be. All right? So the idea then today, think about that in the way that we deal in the church today. It tells us, what about leaven? A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. How does this affect us in the church today?
One small thing can permeate the entire. If you look at it on a congregational level, the whole congregation can be led away by just one person's influence.
One doctrine, one false doctrine, one person. It's the old idea of getting a foot in the door. Once the foot's in the door, the entire body can wedge through that door, and that's what happens in the church. False doctrine is like leaven. Once it gets in, Jesus likened it to the idea of the enemy coming in and sowing tares in the field. He said, once those tares come up, if you try to take the tares out, it's not going to happen because you're going to tear up everything else. You might destroy your crop. Let them grow up together. And then what's going to happen? We'll separate them at the harvest. And that's what will happen. But he says, beware of the leaven of Herod, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. The negative, the bad influence that can turn you away from God gets in. And it could be in the congregation, and it could also be within the person. All right, both of those are equally applicable. But beware of those things, because that's exactly that's what will occur. It has occurred, and it will occur again. All right, I like how he brings it back to the idea of the loaves. All right, how many loaves did I take up? It multiplied, didn't it? Multiplied even more than they needed it to. And the idea is not, I don't think he's comparing the idea of that miraculous event being a negative thing. It's the idea that growth happens, and oftentimes if it's the bad thing, you don't want growth. If it's a bad thing, you don't want that leaven to expand. If it's good, of course you want it to. But beware of that kind of leaven. You're looking for good leaven, leaven from God, good things, sound doctrine, faithful Christians. And when those are involved, the church grows and the church expands and the church gets better and better and better and better and better. Okay? So when you think about this, when he asks this question, and it doesn't give us to know whether they answered it or not, but it ends right here with this account. Do you understand? Think about the things I'm telling you. Apply them spiritually, because this is the most important thing, is the spiritual. It's not the physical. Physical things will pass away, but the spiritual is things that will allow us to grow. So yes, we want leaven, but we want leaven from God, not the leaven of Herod or the leaven of the Pharisees, because it's bad. It's negative growth, so to speak. Okay. All right. So let's continue on. After he gets done with this, they came to Bethsaida. And some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village. When he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and he said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Now, if we know anything about the ministry of Jesus and his strict admonition for people not to do certain things, can we, we're not going to assume anything, but could we reasonably assume that this man did what he was supposed to do? Or did he, in fact, go and tell everybody that he knew that Jesus had healed him of his disease? I think we could probably, it's pretty safe to say that he did exactly the opposite, and he went and told everybody exactly what Jesus had done. But this is just yet again another, it's a sign that Jesus is doing to accomplish his purpose. That's why he performed miracles. That's why he performed this one, to prove who he was and the message that he brought. Now, of course, the next one is the one that we go to quite so often, and this is in verse 27. So Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on his way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, this is interesting because we see this throughout, right, where people believe that Jesus was a reincarnation. I mean, Herod believed that. He was a reincarnation of John the Immerser, of John the Baptist. So there was apparently a great deal of confusion when he was spoken of. It is entirely possible that people believed that he was the reincarnation of a prophet. He was the reincarnation of John the Baptizer and all of these different people. So he asked him, who do people say that I am? Well, some say that you are John the Baptist. And then others say Elijah. And others, one of the prophets. All of these great men. Why would they possibly be led into that, the belief of that? Why would people maybe be suckered into that belief system that Jesus was not who he said he was, but was instead John or one of the other prophets?
It's something that Leaven of the Pharisees was spread around.
Yeah. What's a good reason?
They were looking for something.
Okay.
Well, they weren't sure.
Okay.
They weren't expecting, I guess, the Messiah to come because there had always been prophets who came.
Right.
So it just, I guess, logically it made more sense that if someone of God came, it was going to be a prophet.
But they believed in the Messiah. They believed he was going to come, but nobody believed he was going to come in their lifetime. That's like today. I mean, how many people genuinely believe that they're going to see Jesus coming to take them home? Most everybody. It's sort of a given that we believe I'll die and I'll be laid to rest, and then when Jesus comes back, I will be resurrected and I'll go to meet him in the clouds. No one really thinks that I might be part of the generation that is here when Jesus comes back. I don't know anybody that really believes that's going to happen. We look at it, the world is always, the sun has always arisen, it's always set, the seasons have always come, the years have come and gone, and we will be like everyone else. Jesus is going to come back, but it'll be some different generation further down the road. Yeah, he's coming back, but it might be another 100, 200 years. And we don't really stop to think that it may be this very afternoon. We may be driving on our way home, and the Lord has, his patience has come to an end, and he is going to bring this world to an end. He's going to destroy it, and his son is going to come back to bring his church home. It's entirely possible. And it may be very much that. Simply, yeah, he's coming back, he's coming, but it's not going to be with us. And surely he wouldn't come and manifest himself to me. You know, I'm just this guy laboring, in Judea, and I've come from a long line of Jews, and I'll die and I'll be laid to rest. And yes, we're praying for Messiah, but is he really ever going to come in my lifetime? Surely not. Yes.
They also believe that because of what he taught, and John the Baptist and Elijah, of course Elijah prophesied, Jesus also prophesied too.
Yes.
So because of the things he said and done, they believe
Yeah.
one of those was,
It's probably a combination of all of these. The idea that Jesus spoke with authority. He knew what he was talking about. And I get the impression that when you heard Jesus speak, it wasn't even the same as hearing like a really good gospel preacher at a gospel meeting, where they get up and they just speak and you think, wow, this moves me to action. This is one who speaks as being one of the prophets of God. And surely this Messiah is not going to come in my lifetime, so this must be, of necessity, one of the prophets. God has sent many to the Jews. I mean, for generations, there have been prophets that have arisen, and, we didn't have one for almost 400 years, and then John, they said John was the greatest of the prophets, and maybe this man is just simply a resurrected John. His spirit has been passed on like Elijah to Elisha.
He didn't look like they thought he would look.
He didn't come like they thought he was going to come. He didn't appear the way he was supposed to appear. He didn't take on the form that they thought he was supposed to take on. He was born. They didn't know anything about him. And surely, if there had been a Messiah, there would have been a proclamation by now by the king and by everybody to say, "Behold, we've got the Messiah." Yeah.
that just showed you they weren't listening to the prophet.
No.
Because the prophet said he would come the way he came. But they were looking at it from their standpoint.
That's right, a physical standpoint, right? He would have been born to a wealthy family, probably within the royal lineage. I mean, they said he was going to, their belief, he's going to sit on the throne of David. Well, surely he would have been born, but not to like the least of the family of David. I mean, Joseph, he was in the lineage, but his family was really of no real account. Look at where they lived. I mean, they didn't even live in the right spot.
They say, did any good thing come out of
No good has ever come out of Nazareth. No prophet had ever come out of Nazareth. But he did speak with authority, so surely he's just simply a resurrection. He's a reincarnated or resurrected John, or one of the, or Elijah, or one of the prophets. And it was a reasonable question because, you know, he's asking, what are people saying about me? What are they saying about me? You know, the disciples spoke to more people than he did. I mean, they were out there in amongst the brethren, and as they were going out and preaching, they talked to folks and what was going on. So it says, who do people say that I am? John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. But he asked them, but who do you, my disciples, say that I am? Now, we got to be careful that Peter is not simply usurping authority. He's not assuming some sort of authoritarian standpoint. I believe that when he speaks these words, he is giving that confession of all of his comrades. This is, who do you? He didn't say, Peter, who do you say that I am? He says, who do you as a group? And Peter says, and he answers this. He says, you are the Christ. Now this is big. It's the first time we found this to be acknowledged in audibly, you know, in an oral fashion by any of his followers. You are the Christ. The only person that said this before this is who? John. Behold the Lamb of God. Peter says, you are the Christ. The Christ, singular. It's a definite article. All right? The Christ. And amongst the Jews, you didn't have a definite article of the. It was simply, you are Messiah. It was implied that there was one and one only. You are Messiah. Now, again, this is a huge confession, let's just say. A huge statement on the part of the disciples, because they're giving voice to something that Jesus has been alluding to, and it's been leading up to this point. But they finally make this public declaration that he is Messiah. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. So in other words, what you believe about me, you keep to yourself. You don't say anything to the people. Don't tell them that I'm the Messiah. There's going to be time for that, but right now this is not the time for it. He still has work to do. He still has a continuing ministry. And as a matter of fact, he begins to teach them the things that are going to happen. He says, and he began to teach them, verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man, and of course referring to himself, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. Now this idea of Son of Man is rather important because he refers to himself as Son of Man. Where else do we find, what other book of the Bible do we find Son of Man? Book of Ezekiel. And that term, Son of Man, refers to, in Ezekiel, the Son of the Messiah, the one that was chosen, the one that was to be sent to the lost sheep of Israel, the one that were going to restore Israel in spiritual form, not physical form, restore Israel, and not only that, but bring all of the nations of the world to God, all nations everywhere. We're going to come to God through the Son of Man that we read about in the book of Ezekiel. So it's interesting that he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And he teaches them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected. And we find this in where? What book of chapter do we often read at the communion? Huh? Isaiah 53. All right, so all of this has been foretold, that the Son of Man is going to come. He's going to do these things. He's going to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. So he's going to be rejected by authority. He's going to be rejected by authority. Then he is going to be killed. Interesting. Killed. Not die of a ripe old age. He's not going to live to a good old age and be buried with his fathers. He is going to be killed by the same authorities. And then what's going to happen? After 3 days, he is going to be raised again. Not by his own power, but by his Father's. God is going to raise him from the dead. He will not raise himself from the dead. God will raise him from the dead. His Father will, as he had done before that. Every person who's ever been resurrected by the power of God. Jesus performed that, but all that power and authority was given to him by God. Yes, ma'am.
Those 3 days are not necessarily 3 whole
No. And that's important because so many people think that the timeline doesn't add up. For the Jews, a portion of a day was considered that day. So if he was killed, if he was murdered, I'm going to say murdered. If he was murdered on Friday and he was raised on Sunday, it was 3 days. Don't let people trip you up and say, well, yeah, but if he was killed on Friday, 3 24-hour days later would put that's not the way it works for the Jews, and it's not the way it works in the Scriptures. He was killed on a Friday, he was raised on Sunday. That is 3 days. All right? A portion of a day was considered a day. All right? So he's going to be rejected by the authorities, the people who supposedly had it all under control, the ones who had the knowledge and had the wisdom, had the discernment that were able to do all of this. They were going to reject him. All right. Then they were going to kill him, and then he was going to be 3 days and then raised up. And he said this plainly. So this is not couched in language, figurative language, is it? This is plain and simple. The Son of Man is going to be killed. He's going to be resurrected. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Again, Peter being maybe on the little impetuous side, but it's like anything else. Not having your mindset where it needs to be. If the man who just acknowledged as Christ is the one telling you about the plans of God, then you need to pay attention again to the plans of God. You need to be open and receptive to God's will and not your own. Peter is being, like most of us would be, selfish. We wouldn't want to lose our Messiah, this rabbi that we've been traveling with and been a disciple to. We wouldn't want to lose him, especially to murder at the hands of the authorities. So Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. And what happens then? What does Jesus have to do? He rebukes Peter. Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus has to rebuke Peter. He has to set error straight. That's a lesson for us. Don't allow error to go unchallenged. Now, how we do it, we have to be very careful about how we do it. We have to be loving and kind, forceful when we need to be, but we cannot allow error to go unchallenged. All right? So he takes Peter and rebukes Peter. Now, thankfully, he said he took him aside, so this is something that happened between Jesus and Peter alone, but Jesus has to rebuke Peter. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, that must have been difficult for Peter to hear, because Peter has just gotten through with doing what he believes to be the right thing to do, doing what God would have. Surely God doesn't want his son to die. Surely there's something that must be done about this. We need to head this off before it occurs. Maybe not go where you might be in trouble with the authorities. Maybe this is something we need to do. But Peter's not want Jesus to die. But Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Man, that'd be difficult for me to hear. But if I'm going to try to disrupt the plans of God, this is something that I need to hear. All right? "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter's coming from this from a selfish standpoint. Understandably so, but it's a selfish standpoint. Mm-hmm.
What comes to my mind, there was somebody, I don't know who it was, they were sick. And I was praying, Lord, heal them if you will. And I kept praying, and then I said it was me said that. Then I heard a little voice in my head say, if it was left up to you humans, nobody would ever die.
That's true. That's true.
I got shocked and said, where did that come from? Then later on I thought about it. I said, do you realize how many people would be 3 and 4 and 500 years old? Because we really don't want nobody to die.
No. I don't know how many people have, you have people who are in their 90s and they've lived a good long life and they're on death's door and people are still healing. Lord, give them back to us. Give them back to us. And the Lord's saying, look, you've had them for 90-something years. They've lived especially if they're servants of mine, why wouldn't you want them to come home? Let them come home to me.
That goes back to man.
Yes.
That's what he says.
That's right.
If
Yeah.
I ever make it to that age, I'll make it clear not to.
And it's interesting because you get when you're younger and you've got people that old that you care for, you don't want them to go. But when you have people that are that old, they're the ones that are saying, "I'm ready to go home. It's time for me to go. I've lived a good long life. I'm ready. I'm ready to be released from this. This is not, as Mr. Williams told us several times, getting old is not fun, right? So getting old is not fun, and unfortunately, a lot of times that's what occurs. Our bodies wear out. We're ready to go. We're tired. And it is a release for us to be removed from this tabernacle and fold our tent and go on and really see through eyes clearly for the first time and not through it as a mirror dimly. All right? But he says this. He says, "You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." We are selfish people. All right? We have to temper that selfishness. There are times when selfishness is good. I'm jealous of my wife's attention, and it's a good thing. I need to be. That's how it's supposed to be. But there's some times when our jealousy and our envy and our selfishness needs to be put aside, and we need to concentrate on what does God want. And that's why when we pray, we do pray, "Lord, if it's your will, this is what we want to happen. This is what we want. We want this person to be healed. But Lord, you have a better sense of things. You see everything, and you know what's going to happen. And Lord, if they're not going to pass, but their lives are going to be just full of pain and turmoil, then maybe it's best for them to just simply be allowed to go." All right. But anyway, he says this. Peter rebukes him, and then he has to rebuke Peter. He has to correct that error. You're striving against God in what in your desire. Don't strive against God. All right. So he calls the crowd. He finishes this discussion with the disciples, and then he calls the crowd to him with his disciples. And he says this. Now, this is probably one of the biggest charges that Jesus has made yet thus far to the people who are following him. And look at what he says. "If anyone would come after me," follow me, essentially is what he's saying. "If anyone would follow me, let him deny himself." Now, this is what Peter's having to do, right? He's having to deny himself. He doesn't want his rabbi to be killed. "Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his own soul?" Remember, keeping your mind on the things of God, not the things of man. That translates into a lot of different arenas, doesn't it? A lot of spheres of influence. Our everyday lives, are we concentrating on the things of God, or are we concentrating on the things of man? What is our attention? Where is our attention focused? For a lot of people, it is focused exclusively on the material. Everything they do is geared towards accumulation and influence and power and notoriety, and that's their attention. That's everything they do is with that in mind. I mean, there's a reason that there are people that they spend their entire lives with a camera pointed right at them and putting it on YouTube and Facebook because they crave notoriety. They crave people to know their names and to cite them as an influence. And God's saying, listen, all of that is vain. It is vainglory, and it will accomplish absolutely nothing. You keep your mind on me, and I promise you something great. You do that. Have you seen the kind of people that do that? The narcissists that engage in that kind of behavior? These are not people that I want to be an influence to me. I might watch something they do, maybe, but they're certainly not an influence on me. I don't want them to be an influence on me or my family. But he says, here's what you got to do. If you want to save your life, you got to lose it. If you want to save your life, you got to lose it. If you're going to follow Jesus, you have to take up your cross and follow him. Now it's interesting because when on that day of his crucifixion, did any of those disciples pick up a cross and follow him? Not one of them said, if you kill him, you got to kill me too. That would have been a noble thing, but being very, very human. I mean, think about it. Jesus didn't want to go to that cross, even knowing full well that he was going to be resurrected. He did not want to go to that cross. He was willing to in obedience. So I'm not sure, we cannot really throw rocks at the disciples for not wanting to go to that death either. Because they weren't promised a resurrection, at least not a physical resurrection. Jesus knew. So he says, I'm going to die for 3 days, and I'm going to be raised again. Those disciples did not have that promise. So to throw rocks at them for not, I'll climb up on a cross too, I can't blame them for that.
You think about, they had done it and resisted, and all of them been killed over that.
Yeah. It happened the way it was going to happen. It happened the way it was going to happen. Their human nature won out, and they fled. But in doing so, they preserved their lives, and God, even in preserving their lives, preserved the church through them. That happened even when Jerusalem was destroyed. What happened to the Christians? They fled. And what happened to the church? It was preserved because they ran away. They left and took the gospel with them everywhere they went. Yeah.
It's real easy to, like, you know, a couple thousand years later, be like, well, I would have. But, you know,
Yeah.
the disciples knew enough that Jesus never asked them to walk with them to be crucified
No.
alongside him. If he did, then that's a different story. That they would have turned away from him and said, no, I don't want to be part of that. I mean, Peter denied him. That was bad. But I mean, if you were with Jesus all that time, all these disciples were with him during his entire ministry, and it gets to that point and nobody walked with him, that says something about the circumstances about it. And who are we to say that we would have been greater than the apostles in order to and say, oh, I definitely would have walked alongside them.
In my younger years, I used to kind of almost be resentful of the guys. I thought, you know, because you have that vain sense of yourself. Well, if I'd been there, I'd have been hiding behind the robes of the guy that was hiding behind the robes of the guy who was hiding behind I'd have been like fourth guy in line, going, I don't want to die. I know that now. At the time, I thought how horrible that is. How could you possibly abandon your friend and your Savior? And they even say that, you know, no, we would never deny you. We would never. They even said that.
After admitting who they knew.
Correct.
Which is just, the circumstances must have been just more than we can ever read.
Yeah.
He didn't ask them to die. He doesn't ask us to die for him, which we will.
Be willing.
He asks us to live for him, which should be a lot easier, and we can't.
Yeah, we have a hard time doing that. Yeah. But he says this. He says, if anyone deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And this absolutely lends itself to the idea that, and the concept that when we decide we're going to follow Christ, we deny ourselves. We deny ourselves everything that we want. Getting back to verse 33. Set our minds on the things of God and not on the things of man. That's how we deny ourselves. That's how we deny ourselves. We deny our carnal nature. We rebuke it. We bring it under. We wrest it like Paul did. We bring it under our control. That even if we want to do something, we're not going to do it because we are setting our mind on the things of God. You know, just because we're children of God doesn't mean that we're not going to be tempted. It means that we're going to do everything we can to avoid that temptation. And then even when we're tempted, we're going to do everything, including allowing God to give us a means of escape to not fall prey to that temptation, to not give in to that temptation. But we set our minds on the things of God. That's how we deny ourselves. Take up our cross and follow him. Be willing. He's not asking us to die, but we would be willing to die for him, to fall asleep in Christ. Okay? He says, for whoever save his life will lose it. All right? So in other words, and here's the idea, the concept that if we're not willing to die for him, then we're not worthy of him. Willing. Again, he's not saying, hey, I want you to go and self-immolate in the middle of the town square. He's not asking us to die for him. He's saying, I want you to be willing. Are you willing to lose your life in order to save it? And I think he's alluding to what's going to happen to the Christians in just a few short years, where they're going to be required to either give allegiance to the emperor of Rome, or they're going to give allegiance to their heavenly Father. Which one are you going to choose? Well, there were probably plenty of folks, lukewarm Christians, who sold out almost immediately. I'm not going to die. I love God, but boy, I love myself more. So I'm gonna preserve my life. Well, if you're willing to do that, then you're not worthy of Him. But how many Christians said, I will not bend the knee to the emperor. My allegiance belongs to God and God alone, and they lost their life. I mean, he's alluding to this right here.
Well, they wrongly argue. They say, well, God wouldn't want me to die. He wouldn't want me to say that I'm a follower of God and then be murdered for that.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound
Yeah.
right. So then they, which is completely opposite of what. Yes.
Well, it's interesting because there are a lot of people who believe, well, a loving God would not do this, and a loving God would not do this, and a loving God would not do this. And here he says, if you're worthy of me, then this is what you're willing to do. Yes, ma'am.
When I think about it, I think about Him wanting us to deny the things of this world.
Yes.
That takes us from Him, as well as physical death. And I'm thinking about Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
It says when the 666 come on board,
Mm-hmm.
that people are going to have to choose. They'll have to take that mark. I don't know.
Who do you belong to? He even asked them this question. Remember, he holds up the coin. He says, whose image is on this coin? They said, Caesar's. He says, then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but render unto God. Who do we belong to? The coin belonged to Caesar because it was his impression on it. That coinage was a mark for the realm. Whose image is on us? It's God's. So we render unto Caesar the things that are marked for Caesar, and we have to be willing to give that up. If that's what it takes, we have to be willing to cast it aside and say, I want no part of it. But whose imprinted on us? Whose image is imprinted on our hearts? It's God's. If his image is imprinted on us, then who do we belong to? We belong to God.
How does that fit in with Revelation?
That's a good question. It might be a question for another time because we're getting ready to close out here. But the idea of this, of the number of you talking about the number of the beast being 666.
And they say you have to take the mark. And those that don't take it,
Will not be allowed to buy and sell and all of that. I believe I hold to the timeline theory of that. That was something that was going to occur for the Christians at that particular point in time. I don't believe it necessarily now, but the concept still remains, though. The concept still remains. Whose image is on us? If it is God's, then we belong to God. If it is on Satan, listen, Satan makes all kinds of rules in this world, right? There are things that you might want to do that you cannot do unless you give wholeheartedly over to evil doctrine. There are places there are jobs that you can't hold. There are things that you cannot do because the devil has a pretty good stronghold on a lot of that. I'll tell you this, and then we're going to close out. I was in a conversation. There was a fellow that had posted a video on YouTube, and I was scrolling through and I watched it. There's a fellow that commented below, and he was talking about. He said I'm tangentially related to the entertainment industry. He said I've been in some movies. He said I could tell you privately. I'll tell you who I am. I don't want to put it out there because he said mark my words. He said there are parts of that industry that unless you wholeheartedly endorse that degeneracy. Just absolute degeneracy. Unless you do not subscribe to that doctrine. He said, you will not find work. They want people that engage in that kind of irreverent, abhorrent behavior. And if you don't subscribe to that, you don't have a job. And so I engaged him in a little private conversation. I said, I don't want you to name any names. He said, I don't want to hurt your career or anything like that. I said, but could you just answer just a couple things for me? He answered it very truthfully. He says, are there good people? He said, absolutely. He said, there are people who have not gone wholeheartedly into this. He said, but there are way more people than you think who are absolutely, completely, 100% involved. Not just on the periphery looking in. I mean, involved in that. And I believe that doctrine, even if that was specific to the first century church or the second century church, I believe that it still holds true today. Who holds sway in this world? Who had the power to give Jesus the capitals of the world? Satan. Satan is in control of this world. And what I mean by that is his doctrine holds sway. The earth is still God's footstool. But Satan is the prince of this world. He is the one that has utmost sway. He is the one whose doctrine is being followed. And you better believe there are things that you can't do, and there are places you can't go, that you cannot do that unless you've subscribed to Satan's doctrines. And I mean, you just look around. The world is full of degeneracy. And they want you to be a degenerate with them. It makes them feel better about themselves.
Well, if everybody's a degenerate,
Nobody, exactly. If everybody's a degenerate, then nobody's a degenerate in their minds. In their minds. So I believe that's true. I believe that it is true.
They said secret society, a lot of the stores, and they've even named some of the stores that part of the secret society.
Sure.
And my late brother lived in California, Los Angeles, and he said they have more satanic churches than they have Christian churches. He said you can find satanic churches. He said they actually involve themselves in satanic practices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they think that they don't know they're playing with fire. They think that this is just a way that they can be degenerate and have their practices being thought of as okay. They have no idea the kind of force that they're playing with. They're playing at church. See, we're actively involved in church. They're playing at church. We're serious about it. They are playing with forces they cannot begin to understand. And they're going to lose their souls over it. Christopher Lee, who was a big actor for a long period of time, he had a library full of the occult, books of the occult. He was not an occultist. He was actually a practicing Anglican, not a Christian, but he was a practicing Anglican. He said, I got those things, he said, when I was young because I found them fascinating. He said, they said, what are you going to do with your collection after you die? And he says, I told him to destroy it. He says, you get involved in that, it will destroy your mind and it will destroy your soul. He knew that, and he said, I've seen this occur. I've seen all of this happen. These people are depraved, and they want you to be depraved too. And they will find a way to get you to be depraved. But again, all of this is the idea of setting our sights on the things of God, setting our mind on the things of God and not the things of man. Because this is what the things of man is. This is how it manifests itself. In degenerate practices and depravity and godlessness and lasciviousness, and they think it's just, I'm just living my life the very best I possibly can. I'm enjoying myself as much as I can. They have no idea what it's going to do to their soul. Not one bit. They've given themselves over into it. Okay, next week we'll pick back up on this again. Good to see everybody here this afternoon. So 714 is our closing song. So let's turn to 714, and we're going to sing. How many verses?
We'll sing the first and last.
Okay.
We'll obey.
With the Lord.
evening, we pray that we have gained measure of knowledge that we can apply to our lives. Father, we pray that you'll give us great influence on others for the good. Father, we pray again as pray for